My name is Julia Mahoney. I am the Education Program Administrator for Renew Theaters, and I want to welcome members from the Ambler, the County, the Princeton Garden, and the Highway, as well as members from the Majestic in Gettysburg, which is partnering with us this fall. I also want to thank the Vesta Fund, which has provided us an additional grant to expand this program. We're continuing our classic film series, but have added other tracks to our deep focus discussion program, such as our Asian American film series, which we are discussing this evening. So tonight we will be talking about the Justin Chon films Gook and Blue Bayou as the second talk in our Asian American film series, which is guest curated by Princeton professor Ann Chang. I also want to mention that we have an upcoming event next Tuesday, November 2nd, in our Middle Eastern Cinema series on the film Women Without Men. You can find more information about past and upcoming talks at our website, deepfocus.film. So I'm going to go over a couple of Zoom protocols. It's a pretty intimate group, though, so I think we'll be able to talk to one another pretty freely. I request that everybody remain on mute unless speaking. We will start with a talk led by Kinohi and then open it up to discussion. If you have a question or comment, we'll start off by using the raise hand feature or just by raising your hand, but then we can just talk to one another as the conversation flows during the Q&A. And you guys are welcome to use the chat feature as well. It's another way to get different ideas and little pieces of discussion going. So our speaker for tonight is Kinohi Nishikawa. Kinohi is an associate professor of English and African American studies at Princeton University. He teaches courses on African American humor, African American literary history, and Afro-Asian studies. He's the author of Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction, and the Making of a Literary Underground, and of several essays and book chapters on Black print culture and publishing history. For the American Studies program, Kinohi teaches an undergraduate course titled Black and Asian American Identity in America, which examines cross-ethnic relations in literature, film, and culture from the Los Angeles Rebellion of 1992 to today. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Professor Nishikawa.
Okay, thank you for that. And thanks to you all for being here. Because we're an intimate group, I'm going to look forward to hearing your thoughts on these two films, on Justin Chon, or really on any aspect of Asian American films and this series. So in other words, even though I have a few prepared comments that hopefully give you a sense of who Chon is and what I take to be his artistic intent in these two films. So even though I have a few comments that I want to share to that effect, I also want to hear your thoughts during an extended Q&A. To that end, I do have a PowerPoint that I hope will supplement my comments. And Julia assured me that I'll be able to share this. So I'm going to share this right now, okay? Share screen. Let's do this. Okay, and let's blow this up. First, I want to thank my colleague at Princeton, Ann Chang, for inviting me to speak as part of this online series dedicated to Asian American films, to Deep Focus for hosting this series, and to Julia Mahoney for facilitating tonight's event. Now, it's a good moment to be having conversations like these insofar as events of the past 2 years have brought to light the diversity and complexity of the Asian American experience in fraught, yet I think ultimately revealing ways. And I hope you'll have a chance to check out all the films in this series through your local theater in the region. Now, I'm especially pleased to present on Justin Chon, given that we have here a writer-director whose feature films challenge perceptions of Asian America by moving beyond the notion that in order to understand the particularities of racial or ethnic experience, you must proceed against the backdrop of a hegemonic whiteness. In Gook and Blue Bayou, we certainly have white characters, and white racism is a major theme in their storylines. But whiteness as such doesn't set the terms by which characters of color define themselves. And this is really something I want to emphasize tonight. Their hopes, their dreams, their ambitions, their outlooks on life are far more complex than what whiteness would ever dictate to it. Questions of class, culture, family, and citizenship status exert an equal influence on how these characters make their way in the world. And Chon depicts this through a kind of multi-ethnic aesthetics that challenges what we might even think of as a, quote, Asian American film. And in what follows, I want to share with you what I take to be his multi-ethnic aesthetics. Now, what I just said is perhaps an unexpected turn, given that Chon, Justin Chon, started out as a child actor in Hollywood, appearing in bit roles on network shows, and then a more substantial one on Nickelodeon's Just Jordan. Some of you may have remembered him as an actor on these shows, but really, I think most of you remember him or first noticed him when he got his big break playing Eric Yorkie, a high school friend of the lovelorn Bella in the blockbuster film adaptation of the Twilight series. So yes, that's Justin right there as Eric. In the 2010s, Chon acted in other films, including one produced by Martin Scorsese and television drama series, steadily building his profile. But he also turned to directing with 2015's Man Up, his first feature film. Now, while that stoner film, yes, stoner film, we can talk about that in another series, perhaps with Harold and Kumar, didn't make too much of a splash. It set Chon up for his 2017 film Gook, which is a part of this series, okay? So Man Up was his first feature, and it set him up for Gook, which is part of the series. He wrote, directed, and starred in Gook, and it was released on the 25th anniversary of the Los Angeles Rebellion. Now, the film, as many of you know, is set during that episode of social unrest in the neighborhood of Paramount. Two Korean-American brothers who run a shoe store befriend a young Black girl, Camilla. Racial and ethnic tensions escalate on the first day of the rebellion, leaving groups factionalized and divided, while this unlikely trio struggles to hang on. The film premiered at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Next Audience Award, and it won a slew of awards in addition to that, including the Grand Jury Award for Best Narrative Feature Film, Best Director, and Best Actress, and also an Audience Award at the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. So this is an award-winning film that really highlights Chon as an artist of the first order. Sundance is no small thing. So it gets distribution with Samuel Goldwyn and really gives him a kind of mainstream audience that most indie filmmakers don't get. After the relatively muted release of his third feature, Miss Purple, in 2019, Chon returned this year with Blue Bayou, which he directed, wrote, and starred in as the tattoo artist and Korean-American adoptee Antonio LeBlanc. Now, I'd like to focus most of my comments on this release, since it's the one that lines up with your theater's screening, okay? But I'm happy to talk about both, or really about Chon's aesthetic in general. So this is just a way of framing discussion. Now, like Gook, Blue Bayou unsettles the by now familiar understanding of Asian Americans as pinging between the poles of whiteness and Blackness in the American racial hierarchy. He unsettles that familiar way of thinking about Asians as pinging between these two poles. Model minority on the one hand, or third world subject. Honorary white, or indeed Gook, a racial slur that in effect can sound like the N-word depending on how it's used. Blue Bayou sort of brackets this thinking of Asian America as always only ever shuttling between blackness and whiteness. It brackets that and gives us a Korea-born, Cajun, Louisiana raised, adopted felon whose last name literally means the white. He's married to a white woman, has a stepdaughter whose father is a New Orleans police officer, and runs with a multi-ethnic gang that steals motorcycles to sell on the black market. The dreadlocked leader of the gang, incidentally, is played by Altonio Jackson, a Black Asian actor and tattoo artist from New Orleans. Indeed, there's a certain element of Antonio that seems to be grounded in Altonio Jackson's real life. Now, as you know, the central drama of the movie is Antonio's fight to stay in the country after being sent to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, for a skirmish with his wife's ex and his police officer partner. While we've become accustomed to harrowing stories of family separation at the US's southern border with Mexico, Chon dramatizes one of the lesser known casualties of such crackdowns, where deportation will send someone thousands of miles away across an ocean to a country at best dimly remembered. So, given everything I've just described, complexity abounds in Blue Bayou. And simply saying this is the story of a Korean American father fighting to keep his family intact misses so much of what makes Blue Bayou a powerful work of art and social commentary. Now, though Chon's vision is indeed unique, the storyline of Blue Bayou is, as he notes, based on real-life incidents of Asian American adoptees being deported for one reason or another. Here we are reminded that for a whole host of immigrant populations in the United States, the question, where are you from, is always loaded, inevitably leading to the follow-up, no, where are you from? Where are you really from? And as you know, this is what begins the film. In Antonio's case, the second question becomes, much to his shock, utterly consequential when he learns that his botched adoption has left him in citizenship limbo. Now, immigrants of all colors are subject to this questioning. And the teen romantic drama, The Sun Is Also a Star, is another recent film that tackles deportation, this time as seen from the eyes of a Black girl being deported and her Asian love interest. So I encourage you to see The Sun Is Also a Star for a very interesting complement to Blue Bayou, showing how the question of deportation is one that crosses ethnic and indeed racial lines. In addition to transracial adoption, Chon gestures to a long history of Asian immigrant settlement in the Deep South and in the Mississippi Delta region in particular. In this, the character of Parker Nguyen, played by Linh Dan Pham, plays an outsized role. She's the Vietnamese woman who's dying and she's losing her hair and she gets tattoos from Antonio. Parker gives voice to the long-standing Vietnamese American community presence in New Orleans, many of whom settled there as refugees in the wake of the Vietnam War. What's really cool about Blue Bayou is the way Chon shows Antonio to be alienated from even other Asian Americans in his own city. Now, remember that when Parker invites him to her family get-together, he needs to take a moment to be by himself. He goes to the bathroom. He's not used to being in community with people who treat him like one of their own, or as her father says, acknowledges him for having a, quote, good face. It's a very endearing scene. But once he comes out of his shell, Antonio begins to open his eyes to the way Vietnamese have built a space of belonging for themselves in this corner of Louisiana and are thriving for it. Now, locals to New Orleans know this, okay? You can't escape the Vietnamese presence there, but too many in the general American public don't know New Orleans as a Vietnamese American city in its own right. And Blue Bayou helps us see that through this very important character. Finally, Chon's multi-ethnic aesthetics references and draws on the storytelling traditions of the cinema of Black New Orleans, of which we might include Casey Lemon's 1997 Gothic drama Eve's Bayou, and Ben Zeitlin's 2012 Beasts of the Southern Wild. I'm sure many of you have seen Beasts of the Southern Wild, right? A great complement to it is Eve's Bayou, the earlier film, which not as many people have seen. Now, recall those moments in Blue Bayou, such as we see here, that leave the gritty, realist world of the street to take those flights of purplish and bluish fancy on the water. In one scene, we even see Antonio staring off and imagining a figure, his mother, paddling on the river. Lemons, Zeitlin, and Chon deploy a kind of magical realism, one that we might align in fiction with Toni Morrison or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, to illuminate young people's quest to understand their parents and to sort out very real adult problems as a means of finding themselves. Now, Antonio is older than the girl protagonists of these other two films, but as the flashbacks to his near drowning attest, Blue Bayou is in some ways the story of his need to remember home, right? To revisit that primal scene before he can move on in his life and truly become the father he wants to be to his stepdaughter and to his newborn girl. So the general point I want to make here is that multi-ethnic aesthetics in Chon's hands move us beyond the black-white binary of American racial hierarchy in both representation in terms of the histories that Chon calls on, the experiences he seeks to diversify, but also in form, right? The very cinematic structure of this film is such that departs from standard ways of representing the American racial experience, perhaps a Green Book, a Driving Miss Daisy, and really kind of gives us a different tone and texture that reflects the diversity of multi-ethnic America as it's lived today. So thanks for your attention. And with that, I really want to open things up to hear your thoughts on Justin Chon, on either or both of these two films, or on your thoughts on the movies in general. But I really wanted to give this over to you after setting up the discussion in this way. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Yeah, so if anybody has any comments or questions at this time, we can start off with some hand raising, and then we can all talk to each other. Valerie?
Takes me a while to find my unmute button. I really loved this movie. I haven't seen Gook, but I really was moved by Blue Bayou. And again, I know you mentioned, Kinohi, about to just talk about a person trying to save his family as being kind of simplistic, but I think that's where I am coming from, because that's what moved me. It's a human being who is sort of an underdog in many ways, and he's fighting like crazy to keep his family together. And I think what I liked about the film, the fact that Justin Chon obviously is Asian, but he was just playing a part of a man, a human being, a man with feelings, a dad who wants to keep his family together. And I liked it that it was played like that to me. And I know there's that whole thought about you don't want to take anybody's ethnicity away from them, that we're not that melting pot, we're the salad bowl or the stew pot. But at the same time, there was a beauty or a significance to him, to me, viewing him as a man desperate to help himself get out of that jam and to take care of his family. And that scene at the airport at the end was just gut-wrenching, I thought. Anyway, enough said for me.
No, not enough. I mean, that's Valerie, first of all, I think that's the highest compliment you could pay to Justin. I think he would love what you had to say about the film and what you took away from it. And I don't think we disagree about the kind of aesthetics that allow us to feel so moved by that scene. You know, one of the powerful things about that scene is, regardless of the friction he had with his wife's ex, there's a particular kind of grace in saying Jesse needs to stay home to be with him and to be in a place that's familiar to her in order to flourish as a girl. There's a particular kind of grace there that is deeply human, right? He may want to stay with his wife, obviously, and with his stepdaughter, but there's a grace in his understanding that Jesse, for the moment, is probably better off staying at home in New Orleans. So Chon, I think, would absolutely welcome your response. And I think my point is simply that Chon helps us get there in very subtle ways by giving us a multi-ethnic aesthetics where we're able to feel that humanity without saying it's either or, right? It's either a race thing or a not race thing. It's either a Black thing or a white thing. It's really beyond that kind of binary that allows us to really revel in the complexity of this young man's quest and his struggle. I don't think that ignores race or ethnicity, but I just think it gives us such a deeper understanding of it, so that it's not reduced into these boxes. The white cop in the end is extended a particular kind of grace, and that is just what Antonio thinks is best for Jesse. Ultimately, it's what's best for Jesse. And for him to say that and to have to leave her is truly gut-wrenching, but also very self-aware on his part. In some ways, he's being the best father he can be by saying, please stay. By saying, please stay. Yeah, but thank you for that. I think William had his hand up.
Yeah, I was going to ask about something which is maybe a little bit more of a kind of film nerd type of question, although I agree with Valerie that last scene in the movie really is, I was surprised by how hard I was hit by it. One of the things that struck me watching the movie just as a film is that it has this very heavy film grain look to it. And I think it has a kind of squarer aspect ratio, both of which create the effect of it looking old, right? So I don't know if we can tell exactly when the movie's set. I remember watching it. I don't remember if people are on iPhones or not in it, but I was wondering like what thoughts are on why this kind of deliberately like retro look that goes with the movie. Does that create a feeling of timelessness? That was one idea I had, but there's just different ways that we could approach it. But that struck me about the film formally right away.
That's a very perceptive comment, in that Chon's choice to shoot on, maybe Julia can help us here, on what looks like film the grain is very noticeable, and the texture of the film is very noticeable. Even, right, William, at some points you can see the grains and even little hairs in particular scenes.
Yeah.
You all know this film is brand new, so I'm only beginning my research on it. But regardless, we can say the effect he's going for is certainly retro. And while I feel like I heard a smartphone at some point in the film, we still have to honor the fact that there is a kind of timeless quality that he's going after here, that arguably covers at least a couple of decades of time. In other words, suggesting that this contemporary issue or problem that we all sort of are kind of wrestling with in the wake of 2016 is much older than that.
Right.
I really do think he means that. I think Justin Chon means that, and he means that because in the end, some of the deportees' stories are from the 2000s. So this is not necessarily an issue that's unique to the previous administration. This is an issue, period. This is an issue, period, that we need to address. But that's super perceptive. And I'm only beginning research on this film, but the question of the grain of the film is such a good one, because I couldn't help but notice the texture and the hairs and the this and the that, the tangible quality of this film that gives it an almost archival sort of, or Super 8 kind of sensibility. Did anybody else pick up on that or have thoughts about that?
I was just gonna hop in and say that it is shot on film, and it's funny that you said Super 8, because it's shot on 16mm film, which is we're used to, like, film that is projected today is usually 35mm. So even going with that choice is like more specific and retro.
There you go, William. And I gave a reading of that in terms of Chon wanting us to see this as a problem that's not just of the recent past, but of at least a couple decades in the making. Lucy, did you have a question? I wanted to make sure we got to you before James jumps in.
I had less of a question and more of a comment about, like, the emotional tone of the movie just as it progresses. I felt like it was really effective in the way that it kind of never let up. Like, there was not a whole lot of reprieve. Like, the biggest relief that I think we had in that movie was when the particularly nasty cop was hooked up to the steering wheel and told, like, you're going to jail. And I found that was just, like, the most relief that you really got in the movie. And just throughout the whole thing, I was wondering how it was going to end. And when he drove his motorcycle into the water, I was wondering, like, is that going to be the end of it? But just also knowing at that point, like, there's no way this is going to have a happy ending. Like, there's no resolution in this that's going to satisfy you. And I thought that just really is what made it so moving in a way, and kind of highlighting the reality of these very real situations where there is just no happy ending. Like, no matter what, it's not gonna turn out. There's just not gonna be like oh good, everything is okay in the end.
Lucy, I think you're very right about that. And Justin Chon really lingers on the wife beating up that guy, right? It really is the only moment of relief we have, because even the Fast and the Furious motorcycle scene, you just want to say, what are you doing, right? when they break into the motorcycle dealership, you just want to say, this is not the way to go. So it only builds up your anxiety and tension about the bad choices he's making. And of course, because of what happens after the driving his motorcycle into the water, he misses his court date and relinquishes his ability to appeal. And I think Justin Chon, as writer of this film, didn't want a conventional Hollywood happy ending, which is why, as I was sort of thinking out loud with Valerie here, how could he give us an ending that was moving, but nonetheless didn't tie things up into a neat bow? Because that's not how these things work. And the question of grace and achieving a higher sense of one's fatherhood is my sense, and I think Valerie's sense of how Chon gets us there, as it were. A certain kind of relief, not a happy ending, but a certain kind of relief. By the way, folks, James Kim is my colleague at Fordham University, and he is himself a scholar of Asian American literature and cultural production. So it's kind of awesome that he's here. But James, you are just as much an expert on this and ought to feel like you can contribute to discussion. But thank you for coming. And what do you want to say?
Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your wonderful framing of this film, which I have not yet seen, but your comments just got me all the more excited to see it. And it's just good to see you again and to experience your brilliance, at least over Zoom. I feel like you set me up in this wonderful way, but I'm just going to disappoint you because I don't really have anything intelligent to say, particularly about a film I haven't seen yet. But I just to pick up on William's wonderful point about the 16 millimeter, the choice of 16 millimeter film and the retro feel that gives the overall film. Isn't Gook shot in black and white as well, right? That's also shot with a sort of deliberately retro choice, and clearly a very loaded choice, right? In terms of, because it's a film about Black and Asian conflict shot in black and white, and automatically the form like bumps up against the content in this very, very suggestive way. And so I just on the basis of that precedent, I do think it's safe to say this is a filmmaker who makes his formal choices in very, very, very thoughtful ways. So that I think William's point is very, very much super insightful, and certainly something that could be mined for deep, deep meaning by someone who's actually seen the film. That person, unfortunately, would not be me. But Kinohi, so good to hear your thoughts and to be here with you.
No, you too, and that's a great connection. Yeah, Valerie, please.
Of course, it raised consciousness on a lot of levels, but the thing that struck me was about adoptions. I never realized that some immigrant, children who are adopted from other countries don't automatically become American citizens by, if they're adopted. Like I was stunned by that, and I thought that was a good point to bring up to raise our consciousness about that type of situation. It never occurred to me that adopted child would not then be a citizen just as his parents are or her parents are. So I was appreciative for that consciousness raising.
I have to say that I was ignorant of this really blind spot in our already sprawling and ineffective immigration system. And, given the percentage of people who fall into this blind spot, one might say, well, what's the scale of this? But how many blind spots like this do we have? So many. And that means the system itself has too many blind spots. The system is almost constituted by its blind spots. and that's really the power of this film and its ending. Speaking of Gook and the formal choices, what's really great about Chon is that there's a part of him that is that cinema nerd that William is tapping into. But then there's another part of him, not to say that he's not like this, who's also the kind of Spike Lee, who's also the kind of social commentator, as you put it, Valerie. And the question, I think, for Chon is how to balance these two, the art of cinema and making political statements. And like a lot of Lee's films, he ends with, if you will, an epilogue that clarifies the extent of this issue that Antonio represents. But I saw that educative epilogue as being a kind of Spike Lee moment, right? Where he's trying to do art and politics and balancing the two and using Antonio's story to illuminate a broader issue. But yes, how adoptees, because of paperwork and, you know, in the film, it's explained as soon as Antonio made it to the United States, he was shuffled off to foster care and passed on from one family to the next. And he was in a limbo, a citizenship limbo, which his felony record only exacerbated. And yeah, it's one of these things that we have to reckon with, and that precedes even the last administration's crackdown. So it's really, it was eye-opening for me too. And I'm in the field of Asian American studies, so it really helps me see the issue in a new light. Yeah, Julia.
I love that you mentioned Spike Lee, because when I watched Gook, I definitely saw some parallels there with the Molotov cocktail at the end, even though it's inflicted on the own store rather than, you know, the trash can, and Sal's Pizza from Do the Right Thing, and also like the unnecessary death that is had of someone who is just an innocent. So I'm wondering if there are other influences on Chon that you know about, because Lee is the only one that I thought of. But I love the way he kind of like paralleled those specific things from Do the Right Thing, but changed them just enough as well.
Absolutely. And this is where I'm going to lean on James a bit here, because I think Lee is a great connection. Do the Right Thing is a really good connection. So for Blue Bayou, I really encourage all of you to check out Eve's Bayou, and if you've already checked out Beasts of the Southern Wild, but check out Eve's Bayou. This is a Black woman filmmaker's effort to really tell a coming of age story through a kind of Southern Gothic aesthetic. And it's more Toni Morrison than the film adaptation of Beloved done by Jonathan Demme. And Casey Lemons, the director, is kind of getting a sort of renewed attention as a path-breaking Black woman filmmaker. So Eve's Bayou is undoubtedly referenced in Blue Bayou in very interesting ways. That's another reference. James, can you think of anybody else that Chon might be influenced by?
That's an excellent question. You know, I've only really seen Gook, and so the Do the Right Thing linkage, I think that's very astute and very much on the mark. Yeah, the parallels there are evident, and there are ways in which it's also kind of a corrective, I think, to Spike Lee's. I mean, there is the Asian store in Do the Right Thing, and those folks aren't depicted quite so sympathetically, as I recall. It's been some time since I've seen that film, but my memory is that the Korean grocery store owners are not at all depicted in a sympathetic light. They're basically seen as anti-Black, and there are good reasons for that. There are very understandable reasons for that. But clearly, Gook is meant to sort of give you a kind of counter discourse, right, about Black and Asian relationships. Yeah, I mean, yeah, these are both movies about a race riot. It's clearly the connections are quite obvious. So, yeah.
That's great. Yeah. No, and that's the thing, right? You pay homage to some of your influences, but it's not a carbon copy for the reasons James just outlined. There are issues you might have with certain elements of your influence's work, and so you do something different while paying homage to certain elements of their style. The epilogue is or in some cases, the prologue is a classic Spike Lee device. We see it at the end of Malcolm X, but we also see it at the beginning of Malcolm X, which begins with videotape of the Rodney King beating, right, in a historical period drama. So I feel like Chon is really channeling Lee there. But the other figure I want to mention is the Black woman filmmaker Julie Dash, Daughters of the Dust. Even though that's set in South Carolina, again, thinking about people of color in the South making their own films, it's really a unique kind of aesthetic that relies more on magic and myth and folklore than it does on a kind of gritty realism that we associate with so-called urban filmmaking. So in terms of this lush, Deep South atmosphere, let's look to Casey Lemons and Julie Dash. And for the gritty urban kind of protest filmmaking, yeah, I mean, Spike Lee is kind of like the master of the form. But we can also, James's point about the black and white, once you start turning that in your head, you begin to think of American History X, right? All the recent film, past 25 years, the great American cinema of race that's shot in black and white. We've got to pay attention to that because that's what Gook is inserting itself into while doing something different. And American History X is arguably one of the standout examples of that. So once you kind of identify these formal elements and features, you begin to see how Chon is piecing things together and making a voice for himself through revision, right? By doing his own thing with received art.
I had another question about Blue Bayou, which is only kind of half formed. One of the things that I remember when I first saw the trailer for it, and one of the things that is so striking is just the accent work, right? You talk about deliberately undermining stereotypes and putting people into neat ethnic categories. As soon as as soon as I saw this, obviously Asian man speaking in this thick Louisiana accent, it immediately, something in my brain thinks like, well, that strikes you as unusual. It's not what you're used to seeing in American media. So, bringing together, combining those two very strong identifiers of different types of identities, the accent together with the actor's physical appearance. I don't know if this is really connected to that, but something I was thinking about in the movie's title and about, the way that water kind of brackets the character's experience. We get slowly revealed across the film this early experience with him almost being drowned as a young infant in Korea. And then, there's the kind of scene of quasi-drowning where he drives into his motorcycle into the bayou at the end. And I'm just wondering if you think the movie's doing anything with kind of almost drawing some kind of parallel between almost the landscape or the climate of Louisiana and Korea in a way. I don't know if that's a superficial comparison, but just the I don't know, the bayou in the title. I don't know. I was wondering if the movie is trying to bringing these two landscapes or two kind of climates that we would normally keep mentally very separate together, if that's part of what it's doing.
So this is a really fascinating setup, William, that elaborates on one of the points I made about his multi-ethnic aesthetics. And that has to do with the longstanding Vietnamese presence in New Orleans. Because the particular climate of which you speak, the Bayou type, is more or less gestured toward not by Antonio's Korea-born past, but by Parker's Vietnamese past. So it's Vietnam and Vietnam's tropical climes that, remember, produce the water lily, which is the fleur de lis of New Orleans. And it's through Vietnam that we get a connection to Asia that then Antonio can sort of adjacently relate to. Does that make any sense? So Parker is absolutely critical to this, and her desire to get the fleur de lis tattoo is our way of connecting the geographies of coastal New Orleans, Louisiana, to coastal Vietnam or Vietnam. So it's the Vietnam War that's recollected in the water lilies and the climate and the bayou. And again, what's really impressive about this is that Parker and Antonio are not treated as the same Asian. They have very distinct and very separate kind of histories that they have to learn how to relate to each other. It's not natural. There's not some, secret Asian handshake that Professor Cheng has joined us, right? There's not some secret Asian handshake that connects all of us. Antonio and Parker have to learn how to relate to each other as a Korean adoptee completely on his own, and a Vietnamese woman who actually does have a thriving community in New Orleans. And my final point, we know Antonio is truly on his own because even though he lives in New Orleans, remember, he's from rural Louisiana, just outside of Baton Rouge. And that accounts for what William heard was a very Cajun accent. So it's not a kind of New Orleans accent per se, it's rural Louisiana in the north that you hear in his voice. So all these fine distinctions help us enrich and enliven both characters, both Parker and Antonio, as Asian subjects, but as very different from each other. They have to learn how to get along and see each other in themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, I think like a layer of that accent question almost, even within Louisiana, there's a spectrum of accents. That scene, which is one of the first in the movies, of where are you? He's like, where are you from? Right? And he answers with what part of Louisiana he's from. And it's almost as though he's hoping the question is about his accent, or deliberately pretending the question is about his accent.
Exactly right. It's a great scene because we're in New Orleans, where are you from? You're kind of like, I'm from near Baton Rouge. It's kind of like if we're in Princeton, where are you from? Well, I'm from, Ewing, or I'm from Plainsboro. No, where are you really from, right? And we were talking earlier about the question that begins Blue Bayou, which is, where are you from? Pause. No, where are you really from?
Yeah, what a great part.
Haunting second question is the thing that Antonio has to confront for the entire film, because where are you really from comes to get him in the form of ice.
So I'm so sorry. I had a little bit of an emergency, but I just love what you were saying about the tattoo. So I'm going to ask a question, and you can totally say we already did that, and I would call you later myself and ask you. But have you guys talked about the controversy around the film yet? Oh, so apparently, apparently there's a lot of okay. Have you guys read the article about Bad Art Friend? That whole controversy. Okay, so this is a little bit like that. Basically, there are people who are upset that that the director and writer took stories from the people he interviewed and that they thought he was appropriating the story. And I was just sort of curious whether you've already had a conversation about that, you know.
We have not
haven't
had
had no.
Yeah, you can read about it in Hyperallergic. So it's it's so on the one hand, I do think the film is, and you probably already talked about this, but even just from the little I catch, it's such an exquisitely thoughtful, detailed and textured portrait. And even something so finely done is now facing this question of appropriation, plagiarism of life story, and et cetera. And I just, I don't have any brilliant thoughts about it at all. I was just curious if other people have heard about it and they have thoughts about it.
We have Lucy in the chat has heard about it. Lucy, did you want to say anything more?
I mean, I just read about it kind of on Wikipedia. Like, I didn't really do a whole lot more research into it. But it was just saying that there was somebody who was upset about the movie because it was basically his life, like pretty directly taken from his life and about his life. And he hadn't been asked for permission to use his story. And then Justin Chon was saying that it could be really about anybody, but the original person was saying like, no, this is my story. And that's really the most I heard about it, but there was definitely some controversy around it that I read about.
I think there might have been also something about Focus Features offering like a questionable promotional trip as part of the marketing of the movie.
That too. It was like you could escape
like a trip to Louisiana or something. I don't know. But...
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, because it was really strange that. But they took that away. They like took that back and apologized for it or something.
I do. It does make me wonder, obviously it seems like maybe somebody might have talked to him, and I imagine he did a lot of interviews as part of research for the movie. And, he, in a way, he has to his due diligence. If he had tried to tell this story, I mean, you can ask the question if he should be able to tell this story at all, if it's his to tell. But, in doing due diligence, he must have talked to all these people. But then some people that he talked to saying like they didn't have agency or control. But it's a question of, is this really a specific person's story, or is this a composite that just looks so familiar to many people who are watching it, maybe because it is an unfortunately common situation, these deportations of adopted Americans.
I think I did read that he was aware. He like said that it could be about anybody, but then he kind of also said like that he was taking this person's story a little bit. Like he kind of admitted to it, but then said like, but it could be about anybody. At least from what I've read in my minimal research.
I wonder, is it one of the people at the end? Because he does show people at the end who have gone through the same issue where they had been adopted but were not made citizens. So I wonder if it's somebody that has given like that form.
Yeah. It might have been.
It might have, although it sounded to me like it was someone who was not acknowledged at all. It brings up, I think, a really thorny set of questions about the relationship between ethnography and fiction, especially around authors and subjects of color. I mean, it's just such a, and also, of course, one could make the claim that this is a movie, this is not a documentary, and therefore it is fiction. And, fiction is always pulled from real life. And, and then there's always that very complicated gray area for writers who make use of, their friends and loved ones and, whatever resources come from. But yeah, I do think it's kind of interesting to think about this movie and it's as a genre and its sort of relationship to the documentary. This is not a documentary, but it I think it could be received by some people as such. Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about Spike Lee earlier, a filmmaker who definitely sometimes, this is a fiction film, even if you take something like The Five Bloods, which I think is his most recent feature, but then sometimes it'll just have documentary footage. This movie doesn't do that, or statistics or something else where, this is fictional narrative, but it also is conveying information and it's not feeling like it's going to be shy about being subtle. I mean, this is a message movie, and you can see how it then feels like it's nudged in the documentary direction.
Fascinating. This is, I think moving this in a productive way would be to acknowledge that if Chon did lean heavily on one person's story who didn't feel acknowledged, it just goes to show the complicated ethics of speaking on behalf of someone, which is in fact at the heart of ethnography. But perhaps filmmakers working today in the pressing need to base more and more of fiction on real life experience find themselves, at a crossroads of not knowing how to really do this. On the one hand, this is not Erin Brockovich. We don't want a biopic because then you really kind of have to stick to the script. But on the other hand, you want to imbue your film with the power that everyone from Valerie up till now has talked about, the really human element of this story. And if it's based on really one person's narrative, then how do we acknowledge it? How do we collaborate on it to bring it to the screen ethically? Chon clearly hasn't solved that issue, and we shouldn't expect him to, but I think it's a great point that we at least can acknowledge here and sort of be more aware about in the future. Because again, I really don't think this film would be the way it is if it were a biopic. Biopic has certain generic and cinematic conventions that wouldn't, and Anne, I talked about this earlier in my presentation, really allow us to get to the magical realist elements of the film, which in my viewing align it with the cinema of Black New Orleans, like Eve's Bayou, or in terms of the cinema of the Gullah Islands, Daughters of the Dust. And that's a crucial part of this film, those magical and fantastic elements, which perhaps you wouldn't necessarily find with a biopic. So how do you navigate these difficult waters, as it were? But thank you, Anne, for that, adding this completely new dimension to our conversation. Julia, do you want to say anything else?
I do have one more question for you. It's not like what we were just talking about, just a personal question I have, something I was interested in when watching. But I do know we need to wrap it up soon, so I will make it quick. But I noticed that in both of the films, Justin Chon plays a father figure to a little girl that is not his biological child. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. There's definitely something with like chosen family versus biological family. I have not sussed out the deeper meaning, just kind of a connection I made while watching.
That's great. And I want to invite James and Anne to help me think through this. But Chon seems to be really drawn to characters who are trying to find their place in the world and who themselves don't quite belong, who themselves don't quite fit in for whatever reason in their own communities. So Gook is actually based on Chon's own life, and his father's running a shoe store in Paramount, California. It's useful when, you know, your source material is your own life, right? And even though Chon comes from a Korean immigrant family, I see in the father figure there, and I see in Antonio a real focus on his own alienation, right? These are Asian American men who are not necessarily part of a bigger community. And the girl figure becomes a way for him to find his community. Does that make any sense?
That definitely, yeah, that does.
He himself is alienated for all kinds of reasons, but it's taking care of another. This film is a little bit more complicated, Blue Bayou, because it's really Parker who helps him get to that broader sense of community. But the way that's expressed after Parker dies is through his care for Jesse. He becomes a, quote, man, a real father, when he says to Jesse, stay and be here at home with your mom. So he really likes alienated male figures. Big surprise. And the girl figures become a way for him to reconnect to a sense of home and family. James, Anne, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's that's such a wonderful observation, Julia. I just want to add that clearly he's really interested in kinship, right? What constitutes kinship? What constitutes family? And he has a vested interest in say. And I think actually this is quite insightful, which is actually family and love come through care. You know, I challenge anyone to actually have to take care of a small child, girl or a boy, and not love it. I mean, it's actually that's actually part of, you know, and I never told my kids this, but when they were first born, my first feeling for them, all consciously, my first feeling wasn't so much love per se, but it was pity, right? Because they're such helpless, you know, the infants are such incredibly helpless creature. And you know, and even though it's a huge burden to take care of small infants or children, but that investment in care is actually what creates the bond, the love, and you know, and so I think that he is, you know, I mean, sometimes it's a little bit, it could feel a little set up for me, a little artificial, but I take his point that he is really interested in unraveling or unpacking for us what constitutes relationships and kinship and bonds and, you know, family bonds and love and so forth. And, you know, even his friendship with Parker, right? It's completely random, right? And I love what Kinohi said about how even though they're both Asian American, they actually have such radically different, you know, cultural and social backgrounds. So yeah, I think the figure of the father, the substitute father, is probably very important to me for that reason.
Yeah, just to chime in, it's very difficult to improve on anything that Anne and Kinohi have said, so I'm not even going to try. I'll just observe that a similar thing happens in Gook. Again, I haven't seen Blue Bayou, so I can't comment on it, but a similar thing happens in Gook, which after all does turn on, right, the friendship between the main characters and this young Black girl. So that once again, you see alternative way of imagining kinship, an alternative way of imagining sort of what relationships might mean. And just to just get one last thought in on the controversy that Anne brought to our attention. I mean, I think that controversy sort of highlights for me like this very, very painful sort of problem, which is that the stories that seem most ethically urgent to tell are also the stories whose telling is most ethically problematic, right? Like the need to tell the story, right, of this deportation and others like it is fraught with sort of moral peril, and that's just sort of one of the things that makes artistic expression from the subject position so fraught and so complicated. So I'll just leave it at that. And also just say thank you, Kinohi. This is just, you were so brilliant tonight. I always just love being in the presence of your thoughts. So thank you so much.
Thanks to you all, Valerie, Lucy, William, your comments were really sharp and perceptive, and you've been so active throughout, all three of you, but thank you. Julia?
I just want to thank Kinohi so much tonight. Obviously, our audience, and we are so lucky to have not only one but three experts in the house. But thank you, Kinohi, for leading us with these two kind of parallel films. And Anne, did you want to do just a little preview of what is to come in our Asian American film series?
I've been running around so much. I don't remember what's next.
That's all right. I'll pass the baton right back.
Next one is a May 9th. Oh, it's the farewell.
It's a farewell. Yep.
Oh yes. Oh, so it's it's a fabulous movie. So I hope you watch it. And May 9 is a wonderful Asian American historian from Colombia who has been doing incredible work around actually the history of coolies in a very global way, not just America, but Australia, South America, so forth. But she's just super brilliant. Yeah, come, definitely watch a film with Awkwafina. It's it's also, well, now, first of all, I was going to say it's very melancholic, but this had me sobbing in the theater. So the farewell is less sobby than this. But anyway, please come. It should be really fun.
Thank you. Everybody have a great night. Thank you again, Kinohi.
Thank you, Kinohi. Yay.